The night air in the mountains was cold enough to bite through even the thickest jacket. But for 17-year-old Emily Carter and her boyfriend, Ryan Blake, it was exactly the kind of night they loved. They had been dating for nearly a year, and camping under the stars had become their thing. Friends from school would often tease them about it, but the couple didn't care. Out here, away from the noise of the city, they could just be themselves. No homework, no constant buzzing phones. Just a crackling fire, a sky full of stars, and the quiet whisper of the wind through the pines. That weekend was supposed to be like any other trip, just two teenagers enjoying their summer before senior year began. But instead, it became the last time anyone saw them. Emily's parents remembered her being in a rush that Friday afternoon. She'd thrown her sleeping bag over her shoulder, kissed her mom goodbye, and promised she'd be home Sunday night. Ryan had driven up in his beat-up green Jeep, flashing that easy grin that always made Emily laugh. They had packed lightsome food, water, a small tent, and Emily's old camera that she carried everywhere. There was nothing unusual, nothing to suggest that by Monday morning their campsite would be found abandoned, the tent door left unzipped, the campfire cold, and no sign of them anywhere. The first search party had been optimistic. The area was familiar to Ryan, who had camped there many times before. The trail was easy to navigate, and there was no forecast of storms. Search dogs picked up their scent near a small creek about a mile from their camp, but then it vanished, as though they had stepped off the face of the earth. No tracks, no footprints in the soft dirt. No calls for help. Days turned into weeks, and hope began to fade. Emily's best friend, Kara, refused to believe they were gone. She would visit the Carter family almost every day, sitting in Emily's room as though expecting her to walk back in. Ryan's younger brother would post photos of the two on social media, writing captions like, "Still looking, don't give up." But despite the posters, the news coverage, and the constant pleas for information, nothing new surfaced. It was as though the forest had swallowed them whole. Months passed, and the story slowly slipped out of headlines. Life moved on for most people, but for their families, every day was a question without an answer. Then, one icy morning in late November, everything changed. A group of hikers exploring a remote part of the same forest stumbled upon something unusual. It was a tent weathered, partly collapsed, its fabric stained from rain and dirt. From the outside, it looked like it had been there for a long time. But what caught their attention wasn't the tent itself, it was what was inside. The hikers noticed that the sleeping bags were still laid out, as if waiting for their owners to return. A small camping stove was set up on the ground, a pot half filled with what looked like burned food. There were personal items, Emily's faded denim jacket, Ryan's baseball cap, and next to them, a camera with a cracked screen. It had been left on, though the battery was now completely drained. Everything about the scene felt frozen in time, as if the couple had stepped away for a moment and never came back. The strangest part, however, was what was found just outside the tent. The ground was littered with dozens of tiny, evenly spaced rocks arranged in a perfect circle. They weren't the kind of thing you'd see naturally scattered by wind or animals. It looked deliberate, almost ritualistic. No one could explain why they were there or who had put them there. The hikers, unsettled by the sight, took photos and alerted the authorities. Within hours, investigators arrived, cordoning off the area. When the news broke, it reignited the case in a way no one expected. Social media exploded with theories. Some believed the couple had run into dangerous strangers. Others suggested they had simply gotten lost and never found their way back. A few even whispered about something stranger, something that couldn't be explained by logic alone. The discovery of the rocks especially fueled speculation. People began combing through old local legends, trying to link the finding to stories of the area. Emily's parents were called in to identify the items, and the moment her mother saw the jacket, she broke down. Ryan's father stood silently, staring at the baseball cap in the evidence bag, his jaw tight. The families had so many questions, but the evidence raised more than it answered. If the tent had been there all along, why hadn't it been found? During the original search, if it had been moved, who moved it and why leave it set up like that? The camera became a central focus for investigators. If there were any surviving images, they could hold vital clues about what happened that night. Every inch of the campsite was photographed, every item carefully bagged. Yet, even as the investigation continued, something about the scene felt wrong to those who visited it. It wasn't just the eerie stillness, it was the way everything seemed untouched, almost staged. Ryan's best friend, Luke, visited the site on his own a few days later. He said that standing inside the tent gave him an overwhelming sense of being watched. The trees around the camp seemed to close in, their bare branches twisting overhead like skeletal fingers. He noticed that in the silence, even the usual forest sounds, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, were absent. It didn't feel empty, Luke later told a local reporter. It felt like something was still there. As word of the discovery spread, more people began coming forward with their own stories, strange noises they'd heard near the creek. Lights seen moving between the trees late at night, and in one case, a hiker who swore she saw a young woman, matching Emily's description months after she vanished. Walking alone along a trail before disappearing into the woods, the police, careful not to fuel rumors, kept most details under wraps. But they confirmed one thing: the rocks outside the tent had no obvious explanation. They weren't used for cooking, and they didn't match any known camping setup. They're arranged in that perfect, unnatural circle. For Emily and Ryan's families, the discovery was both a spark of hope and a source of dread. Maybe there would be answers now. Maybe the truth would finally come to light. But deep down, some feared that whatever had happened to the teenagers was far from over. And as investigators prepared to analyze the contents of that camera, one question loomed larger than all the rest. What was the last thing Emily and Ryan saw before they vanished into the night? The answer might be long before the tent was found. The town of Briar Ridge had already been living under the shadow of Emily and Ryan's disappearance. People would glance at the empty seats in the school cafeteria, at the faded missing posters curling on telephone poles, and feel the weight of something unfinished. It wasn't just that two teenagers had gone missing, it was that they had vanished without the slightest trace in a place that everyone thought they knew. Briar Ridge wasn't a big city. It was the kind of town where people left their front doors unlocked, where you could walk down Main Street and recognize every face you passed. The woods that surrounded the town were considered safe, more like a backyard than a wilderness. That's what made it all so unsettling. Emily had grown up here. She was the kind of person who noticed little things. She'd spot a bird's nest high in a tree or remember exactly where a friend left their backpack. She loved photography because it let her freeze those details forever. Ryan was different. He was bold, restless, the kind of guy who would jump into a freezing river just to say he did it. But somehow, they fit together. He made her braver, and she made him notice the quiet beauty in the world. When they first started dating, camping trips had been Ryan's idea. Emily wasn't sure about sleeping outside, but she'd gone anyway. Over time, she grew to love it. Even the parts that scared her. They would spend hours talking by the fire, sharing stories they never told anyone else. And that last weekend in the mountains had felt like any other, at least. That's what everyone believed at first. After the search failed, whispers began. Some said they had run away together, that they had planned it. But anyone who knew them dismissed that immediately. Emily was close to her family, and Ryan had just gotten a scholarship offer he was excited about. There was no reason for them to leave. The idea that they might have simply gotten lost didn't make much sense either. Ryan had an almost instinctive sense of direction. And the area they camped in was only a few miles from the main trail. In the weeks after, the forest seemed to change. Hikers reported finding strange markings on tree-sharp cuts in the bark, always in groups of 3. Others said they heard voices in the distance, too faint to make out. The sheriff's office took the reports seriously at first, sending deputies to investigate, but they found nothing. Eventually, the leads dried up, and the search was called off. The discovery of the abandoned tent months later brought those rumors back to life. People couldn't understand how a place so close to the original search area had gone unnoticed. Some speculated it had been moved there recently, maybe by whoever was responsible. Others thought it had been hidden somehow, maybe under a tarp or brush, until the wind or weather exposed it again. When the police brought the tent back, they cataloged every item, along with the sleeping bags, stove, and clothing. There was a small notebook belonging to Emily. Most of it was filled with quick sketches trees. Leaves Ryan's profile as he looked away. But near the end, there were a few sentences written in her neat handwriting. They weren't dated, but the words were unsettling. We keep hearing something at night. It sounds like footsteps, but it stops when we shine the light. There was no explanation, no follow-up, as if she'd been interrupted. The camera was sent to the lab. Investigators hoped the memory card might still hold something, even if the screen was broken. Rumors spread quickly. Some said there were dozens of photos taken in rapid succession late at night, all slightly blurry. Others claimed there was a final image so strange that the police refused to release it. Officially, nothing was confirmed. Meanwhile, the circle of rocks outside the tent became a focus of endless speculation. Local historians were interviewed, and a few old-timers recalled stories passed down from their grandparents. There were tales about settlers who had vanished in those same woods over a century ago, and about strange stone patterns that would appear near their campsites. One man swore that his father had once found a similar circle deep in the forest when he was a boy. "We didn't touch it," he said. "My father told me to stay away, said it was bad luck." Ryan's brother, Ethan, began spending more time out in the woods after the tent was found. He wasn't looking for trouble, he just wanted answers. He retraced the path from the main trail to where the tent had been discovered, hoping to notice something the searchers had missed. The deeper he went, the quieter it became, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Sometimes, he thought, he saw movement far off between the trees, but when he blinked, it was gone. The families held a small gathering on what would have been Emily's 18th birthday. Friends lit candles and placed them at the edge of the trail leading into the mountains. As they stood there, someone thought they heard a faint snapping of branches from the darkness beyond the tree line. A few people turned, shining their flashlights, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling lingered that something was just beyond their sight. Not everyone believed in strange explanations. Some insisted it was the work of an ordinary person, someone dangerous who knew the woods well enough to hide. But even those who dismissed the more unusual theories couldn't explain why no other traces had been found. No signs of a struggle. No belongings scattered along a path. No witnesses. When winter set in, snow covered the mountains, making further searches nearly impossible. The tent and its contents were stored as evidence, but the families kept photos of it. Emily's mother said she couldn't stop staring at them, as if the answer might be hidden in the details. Ryan's father, on the other hand, avoided looking at them altogether. For him, it was too much a frozen moment he couldn't change. The town moved into the new year, with the case still unresolved. But in quiet conversations, people admitted they felt something about the forest had shifted since that summer. Hunters who had spent decades in the area said the wildlife seemed different, fewer deer, fewer birds. Night seemed to fall faster, and the wind through the trees carried a sound they couldn't quite place, In the midst of this growing unease, a letter arrived at the sheriff's office. It was postmarked from a nearby town, with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and on it, just one sentence typed in block letters. "You're looking in the wrong place." There was no signature, no explanation, and the paper carried no fingerprints. Investigators tried to trace the origin, but with little to go on, it became another unanswered question for the families. The letter was both terrifying and oddly hopeful. If it was real, it meant someone knew something. But it also meant that whatever happened to Emily and Ryan wasn't over. It was still out there, and so, as the snow began to melt and spring crept back into Briar Ridge, the mystery only deepened. The woods waited, silent and watchful, holding on to secrets that no one seemed able to uncover. Somewhere in that vast, quiet expanse, the truth was buried. By the time spring settled over Briar Ridge, the investigation had taken on a strange rhythm. Officially, the sheriff's office claimed they were pursuing all leads. But behind closed doors, frustration was building. Weeks had passed since the letter arrived, and no progress had been made. The only thing keeping the case alive in public memory was the unease that had settled over the town, a feeling that someone or something still lingered in the shadows of those woods. For Emily's father, the main conflict wasn't just the lack of answers, was the quiet tug-of-war between his need to know the truth and his fear of what that truth might be. He spent evenings sitting on the porch, staring toward the mountains, wondering if he should go searching on his own. His wife begged him not to. She was afraid of losing him too. But he couldn't stop replaying the details in his head, thinking of all the small choices that could have changed everything. Meanwhile, Ryan's brother Ethan had grown more obsessed. He began mapping the forest, marking the location of the tent and every strange sighting or unexplained sound reported since the disappearance. His notes were full of small, unsettling patterns, clusters of missing pet reports near the eastern trails, campers abandoning their trips early because of odd noises at night, and more of those strange circles of stones appearing miles apart. It was as if someone was leaving markers, but for what? No one knew. Kara, Emily's best friend, became another thread in this growing web. She didn't trust the official investigation and began speaking to people the police had overlooked: seasonal workers, park rangers, even an old trapper who had lived in a cabin deep in the forest for decades. He told her a story she couldn't shake about hearing voices in the trees late at night, voices that seemed to repeat his name in a whisper, even when he was alone. "You stay too long out there," he warned her, "and the forest remembers you." While these personal struggles unfolded, the police quietly pursued a different lead. The memory card from Emily's camera had finally been recovered. Though most of the files were damaged, a few were intact. The first were ordinary pictures of Ryan cooking by the fire, Emily smiling at the camera, the mountains glowing in the sunset. But the later ones were different. The angle was off, as if the camera had been set on the ground or held at arm's length. In several, the focus was on the dark tree line beyond the campsite, and in one, faint and almost lost in the shadows, there appeared to be a shape too far to make out clearly, but definitely there. The authorities didn't release the image publicly, but word leaked. Soon, the whole town was buzzing with theories. Some thought it was a person watching them. Others swore it didn't look human at all. The uncertainty only deepened the tension. Around the same time, hikers reported hearing what sounded like a woman calling for help near the old fire road, a narrow, overgrown path about 5 miles from where the tent had been found. The search team dispatched to the area came back empty-handed, but the story spread fast. Families told their children not to wander too far from home. Even seasoned hunters started avoiding certain parts of the forest. One subplot emerged when a group of amateur ghost hunters decided to investigate the site on their own. They live-streamed their trip, drawing a large online audience. At first, the footage was uneventful, just shaky shots of trees and nervous laughter. But near the end, something strange happened. One of them claimed he saw a figure standing among the trees, watching them. The camera swung wildly, but by the time they reached the spot, there was nothing there. The group cut their trip short, visibly shaken, and later deleted most of the video. Still, screen captures circulated online, fueling the fire of speculation. For the sheriff's department, this sudden surge in public interest was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought new tips, people calling in to share details they'd never thought were important before. On the other, it also flooded them with hoaxes, false leads, and wild theories. Every promising thread seemed to end in nothing. And yet no one could shake the feeling that they were circling something real, something close. Emily's notebook became another point of focus. A handwriting analyst noted that her writing in the last few pages was slightly different, tighter, with more pressure on the pen, as if she had been tense or afraid. The final sketch in the book was unlike her usual style. It was rough, almost frantic, showing the outline of trees and something standing between them, its shape tall and narrow. No one could say for sure if it was meant to be a real sighting or just an unsettling doodle in the midst of all this. Another conflict emerged between the families themselves. Ryan's parents believed the evidence pointed toward a living suspect, someone who had taken the couple and was possibly still holding them. Emily's parents, however, feared the answer might be something that couldn't be explained in normal terms. The divide made it harder for them to work together, and every meeting with investigators seemed to end in frustration. Adding to the tension, the anonymous letter wasn't the last. A second one arrived in late April, this time left at the back door of the Carter family home. It contained no words, just a small map of the forest, with an X marked far from any known trail. The police advised against following it, warning that it could be a trap. But the temptation was there, gnawing at everyone involved. Ethan wanted to go. Kara wanted to go. Even Emily's father, despite his wife's protests, found himself staring at that map late into the night, wondering if the answers they needed were waiting at that X. But there was also the fear that they would walk into the woods and never come back. Just like Emily and Ryan. And through it all, the forest remained the same on the surface green, sunlit, full of birdsong in the daytime. But those who ventured deeper knew better. They spoke of sudden drops in temperature, of moments when the trees seemed to close in, of paths that twisted in ways that made no sense. The closer they came to uncovering something, the more it felt like whatever was out there didn't want to be found. And in Briar Ridge, people began to wonder if the real question wasn't what happened to Emily and Ryan. The map from the second letter became the turning point. It was impossible to ignore. Every time Ethan looked at it, he felt that same pull. As if the X marked not just a location, but the answer to everything that had haunted them since. Emily and Ryan vanished. He knew the police would never officially go there. Not without proof, and proof was exactly what they didn't have. But waiting around had gotten them nowhere. The longer they hesitated, the stronger the feeling grew. That time was running out. It took weeks of quiet planning before they made a decision. Ethan convinced Kara to join him, and after some heated arguments, Emily's father agreed to come to Co. He couldn't let someone else go into the woods looking for his daughter while he stayed behind. They kept their plan from the authorities, afraid it would be shut down before it began. The night before they left, Kara couldn't sleep. She kept hearing that old trapper's words, "The forest remembers you," and wondering what it would mean for them to step deeper into a place already marked by fear. They set out before dawn, their backpacks loaded with food, water, flashlights, and Ethan's maps. The morning air was damp, and mist clung to the trees as they hiked past the familiar trails and into the less traveled parts of the forest. Hours passed, and the path grew harder to follow. The ground here was softer, covered in layers of leaves that muffled their steps. Every so often, they would find something strange to trees with deep cuts in the bark, or a pile of stones stacked in a way that looked too deliberate to be an accident. By mid-afternoon, the forest had changed. The sunlight was thin and pale, filtered through a canopy so dense it felt like late evening. The air was colder, and the silence was thick enough to notice. No birds, no insects, just the faint sound of their own breathing. It was then that they spotted the first sign they were getting close. A strip of faded red cloth caught on a low branch, swaying gently in the breeze. Kara reached for it, but hesitated, as if touching it might disturb something best left alone. They pressed on, following the map's markings until the terrain sloped downward into a narrow hollow. At the bottom stood something unexpected, an old wooden structure, half collapsed and covered in moss. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't just another random spot in the woods. Something had happened here. The closer they got, the more they noticed. Scratches in the wood, rusted metal hooks on the inside walls, and on the ground, partly buried under dirt and leaves, shoes, worn and familiar. Emily's father froze when he saw it. T recognized it instantly. She had worn those shoes on countless camping trips. T picked it up slowly, his hands shaking before they could process what they had found. The atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavier, colder, and the light dimmed even further. A low sound, almost like a hum, seemed to rise from somewhere deep in the forest. Ethan turned in a slow circle, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Pressing on them from all directions, Kara pulled out her phone to take a photo. But the screen glitched, lines of static cutting across the image. She tried again, but the phone shut off entirely, the battery dropping from full to zero in an instant. Ethan's flashlight flickered, even though the batteries were new. Emily's father muttered that they should leave, but none of them moved. They were too deep, now too close. Then they noticed something else. On the far side of the hollow, beyond the ruined structure, there was another circle of stones. This one was larger than any they had seen before, nearly 10 feet across, the rocks perfectly spaced and half buried in the earth. In the center, the ground looked disturbed, as if it had been dug up and filled in again. The sight of it made Ethan's stomach tighten. The hum in the air grew louder, almost like a vibration, under their feet. A wind moved through the trees, cold enough to sting their skin, even though the air had been still moments earlier. The three of them exchanged uneasy glances, each silently asking the same question: was this what the X on the map had been leading to? And if so, what were they supposed to do now? Emily's father stepped toward the circle, his voice low and trembling as he called out her name. The sound barely carried, swallowed by the forest before it could echo back. In the stillness that followed, something shifted in the shadows beyond the stones. It was too far to see clearly, but it was their shape, tall and still, watching. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, and the figure was gone. But the hum didn't stop. It was in their bones now, thrumming like a warning. Kara grabbed his arm, whispering that they needed to go. But the path they had taken and seemed different now, narrower, unfamiliar. The forest had a way of swallowing landmarks, making even the most familiar trails feel strange. But this was more than that. The trees seemed closer together, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes overhead. The light continued to fade, though it wasn't anywhere near sunset, and somewhere in the distance, faint but clear, came the sound of footsteps. Not hurried, not The footsteps grew louder, crunching through the layer of dead leaves, but they didn't sound rushed. Whoever or whatever was moving toward them wasn't in a hurry. It was almost as if it knew they had nowhere to go. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ears as he scanned the trees, trying to pinpoint the direction. Kara clutched his sleeve so tightly he could feel her nails through the fabric. Emily's father stood frozen, his eyes locked on the shifting shadows beyond the stone circle. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse, thicker, heavier, almost expectant. The hum in the ground hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger, resonating through their legs like the vibration of a distant engine. A sharp, cold gust of wind rushed past them, carrying the faintest trace of something metallic, like rust or old blood. That was when Ethan noticed movement near the disturbed soil in the center of the stone circle. At first, it looked like the ground was sinking, collapsing inward by inches. Then, slowly, something began to emerge, a corner of dark, weathered fabric, like the edge of a tarp or a buried piece of clothing. Kara's voice was a hoarse whisper. "We need to leave. Now." But before they could move, another sound cut through the air. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was a voice, low, distant, and distorted, as if carried on the wind. It called one word, a name. Emily's. The sound made the hair on Ethan's arms stand up. Emily's father staggered forward, shouting her name back into the trees, but his voice was swallowed by the forest in an instant, leaving nothing but that deep, vibrating hum. The circle of stones suddenly seemed less like a marker and more like a warning, a boundary they were never meant to cross. Yet something about that voice pulled at them, an instinctive need to follow it, even as every rational thought screamed to run. And then, as if the forest itself was listening, the path they had come from no longer looked the same. The trees were wronged too close together, bending inward to block the way. The trail had vanished. Ethan tried to stay calm, telling himself they could still backtrack, but the truth was clear. The forest had shifted. Whether it was an illusion or something far stranger, they were trapped. The wind picked up again, and this time it carried faint whispers. Not just Emily's name, but other words-broken fragments of sentences that made no sense, overlapping and fading before they could be understood. Kara was shaking now, her voice barely audible. "This isn't right. This isn't just a place. It's doing something to us." She wasn't wrong. The air felt heavier with each breath, the shadows longer, the cold sinking deeper into their bones. Even the colors around them seemed to have dulled, as if the forest was draining the life from everything in it. And then came the second. Shakithan's phone buzzed in his pocket. It shouldn't have. There was no signal here, no service for miles. He pulled it out, the screen flickering to life, showing a single new message from an unknown number. It contained no text, only an image. His stomach dropped when he saw it. It was a photo of the three of them, Nathan, Kara, and Emily's father, taken from behind. In the picture, they were standing exactly where they were now. Staring into the circle of stones, Ethan's hand went cold around the phone. "This was just taken," he said, his voice barely more than a breath. Kara stepped closer, looking over his shoulder, then glanced up at the trees surrounding them. Somewhere out there, hidden among the shadows, someone had eyes on them right now. Emily's father's expression changed, a mix of fear and determination. Whoever sent that knows what happened. And they're here. His words cut through the hum for a moment, but then the vibration seemed to swell. It's almost angry. From deeper in the trees, something moved again, faster this time, circling. The crunch of leaves came from one direction, then another, closing in. It didn't feel like one person anymore. There were multiple sets of footsteps now, all moving with the same slow, deliberate rhythm. The three of them instinctively drew closer together, their backs nearly touching, scanning the forest for movement. The shadows shifted once more, and Ethan caught a glimpse of something between the trees, a flash of pale, motionless faces watching from the darkness. They didn't move forward, didn't blink, just stared. The hum rose to a low, steady drone that made the ground feel like it was trembling beneath their feet. And then the voice came again. Louder this time, clearer and far closer than before. Emily's name repeated twice. The moment the word "come" echoed through the hollow, the forest seemed to shift again. The shadows bent toward the stone circle, stretching across the ground like reaching fingers. Ethan felt his legs move before his mind caught up, drawn toward the disturbed earth in the center. It was as if something was pulling him forward, not physically, but in his thoughts, in his chest, a gravity he couldn't fight. Kara grabbed his arm, yanking him back, her voice sharp and desperate. But her words felt distant, muted under the steady, bone-deep hum. Emily's father didn't hesitate. He stepped into the circle, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. "Emily, look!" He shouted again, and for the first time there was a reply, not an echo, but a voice. It was faint and strained, yet unmistakably hers. "Dad, help me." The sound cracked through the cold air, snapping all three of them into motion. Ethan and Kara followed him into the circle without thinking, the pull of that voice overriding every ounce of fear. The hum grew louder, rising into a pitch that made the air vibrate. The ground beneath them shifted, and the soil at the center gave way, revealing a dark, narrow opening like a pit or the entrance to something hidden beneath the forest floor. Cold air rushed out, carrying that same metallic scent, stronger now, mixed with damp earth. The voice came again, this time closer. "Hurry!" Emily's father dropped to his knees at the edge of the opening, shining his flashlight inside. The beam disappeared almost instantly into darkness. But for the briefest second, they saw movement below, pale hands reaching upward, then vanishing. Without hesitation, he started to climb down, his voice calling to her over and over. Ethan moved to follow, but Kara grabbed him, her eyes wide. "Ethan, look around you." He turned and froze. The figures in the trees were no longer still. They were stepping forward. Their movements slow, but purposeful. They were human, or at least they looked human. Their clothes old and worn, their faces pale and expressionless. Dozens of them, emerging from the forest, surrounding the circle, and every single one of them was staring at the pit. The hum hit its peak, vibrating so hard Ethan thought his teeth might crack. In the chaos, Kara's flashlight swung wildly, and for just a second, the beam lit up one of the figures' faces. Ethan's breath caught. It was Ryan. He looked exactly as he had the summer he disappeared, no older, no different, tech-stepped for his eyes. They were empty, fixed on the pit, unblinking. Before Ethan could react, Emily's father's voice rang. Out from below, "I've got her." "I've got," the words cut off, replaced by a sharp, guttural sound that didn't belong to him. The flashlight he'd been holding clattered against the dirt and went out, plunging the pit into complete darkness. Something moved fast, then too fast to track, rising from the hole like a shadow given shape. The wind roared through the hollow, scattering leaves and dust in every direction. Ethan felt Kara shove him backward, and they stumbled out of the stone circle just as the ground inside seemed to collapse inward, swallowing the pit, the stones, and whatever had been inside. The figures froze. For a moment, everything was still. Then, as if some silent signal had been given, they turned in unison and began walking back into the trees, their pale faces vanishing into the dark. Within seconds, the forest looked empty again, though the hum still lingered faintly in the distance. Ethan and Kara stood there, gasping for breath, staring at the place where the circle had been. The soil was smooth now, as if nothing had ever been disturbed. Emily's father was gone. So was the voice. And so was any trace of what they'd seen. They didn't speak until they'd forced their way back through the trees, finding themselves on a trail they didn't recognize. It took hours to reach the edge of the forest, and by then, the sun was setting. Only when they stepped into the open did Ethan realize his phone was buzzing again. He pulled it out, his hands trembling, and saw a new message from that same unknown number. It was another photo. This one showed Emily standing alone in the forest, the same pale, empty expression Ryan had worn. Behind her, barely visible in the shadow, Ethan's hands shook as he stared at the photo, the cold evening air burning his lungs with each breath. Kara leaned over his shoulder, her face pale in the fading light. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The image was too real, too sharp, to dismiss as a trick. Emily and her father were there standing deep in the forest they had just left yet. They had searched everywhere. Ethan felt a sinking weight in his chest, a strange mix of fear and guilt, as if they had failed without even understanding the rules of the game they'd been pulled into. They walked the rest of the way to town without looking back. The forests, dark outline growing smaller but never quite disappearing from their thoughts. Streetlights flickered on as they entered the outskirts, the hum of distant traffic replacing the unnatural silence of the woods. Yet the buzzing in Ethan's ears didn't fade. It was the same faint hum from the hollow, buried in the background of everything around him. At Kara's apartment, they sat at the kitchen table with untouched mugs of tea. The phone lay between them, the photo still open. "We have to tell someone," Kara finally said, her voice low but firm. "Police, search team, something." Ethan nodded, but even as he agreed, a part of him knew the truth. Who would believe them? They had no pit, no circle of stones, no proof beyond a single photo from an unknown number. And in that photo, Emily and her father didn't look frightened. They looked like they belonged there. Still, the next morning they went to the police station. They told the story as simply as they could, leaving out the shadows, the figures, and the impossible details. The officer listened, took notes, and promised to follow up, but Ethan could see the doubt in his eyes. When they left, Kara's phone pinged with a news alert. Search efforts for Emily had been scaled back due to lack of new evidence. Days passed. Ethan tried to go back to his normal routine, but everything felt muted, as if a thin layer of fog clung to the world. Nights were the worst. Sometimes he dreamed of the pit and the reaching hands, waking up with the faint smell of damp earth in his nose. Other times, he would swear he heard his name whispered just before he fell asleep. Kara admitted she was having the same experiences, though neither of them wanted to say it out loud because saying it made it more real. Then, one evening, Ethan's phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. His chest tightened as he opened the message. This time, it was a short video. The footage was shaky, filmed from a low angle, but he recognized the forest instantly. The camera moved through the trees until it reached a clearing. There, in the middle, stood the stone circle hole again, untouched, as if nothing had ever happened. Standing at its center was Emily. Her expression was calm, almost serene, and her eyes fixed on the camera as she spoke. "You weren't supposed to leave," she said softly. The words were followed by a sudden distortion in the video. A flash of darkness, and then nothing. Kara's hands gripped the table as they replayed it. The hum was there in the background, stronger than ever. "It's still happening," she whispered. "The forest? It's still there, waiting." Ethan didn't answer. Deep down, he had known this wasn't over. The circle had returned, which meant the pit, the shadows, and whatever lived beneath the ground had returned to. Over. The next week, they pieced together fragments of what they knew. The forest wasn't just a place. It was something older. something that had been pulling people in for decades, maybe longer. The figures they'd seen, the ones who looked human but weren't, might have been people who had once entered and never left. Ryan, Emily, her father, they hadn't been taken. They had been claimed. One night, unable to sleep, Ethan found himself scrolling through old local records online. Buried in the archives was an article from nearly 40 years ago about two hikers who had vanished in the same forest. The only clue left behind was a single message carved into the bark of a tree near where they were last seen. "We are not lost." Ethan's stomach turned. The phrasing was almost identical to something Ryan had once written in his old notebook before he disappeared. Kara agreed to meet the next morning to decide what to do. She showed up with a printed map, tracing out the trails they had taken before, marking the location of the hollow. "If the circle's back, we can find it," she said. Her voice was steady, but he could see the fear in her eyes. This wasn't just about finding Emily anymore. It was about understanding what was pulling people in and maybe stopping it. If that was even possible. They left before dawn, the town still sleeping behind them. The air was heavy with mist, and the forest felt different than before, quieter, but also more aware. They followed the same winding paths, past the twisted trees and patches of moss that looked like they hadn't been touched in centuries. Hours later, they reached the clearing. The circle was there. Perfect, unbroken, the stones cold and slick with dew. In the center, the ground looked undisturbed, but Ethan could feel the hum vibrating beneath his feet. Kara stepped forward slowly, her flashlight cutting across the stones. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, the hum deepened and the air grew thick. From the tree line, figures began to emerge. Not dozens, this time hundreds. They moved silently, their faces pale in the dim light. Among them, Ethan saw Emily. She stood near the front, her gaze locked on him. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear, but he didn't need to. He knew she was telling him to come closer. Kara's hand found his, grounding him. "We can't go in," she said firmly, her eyes never leaving the crowd. "That's what it wants." The figure stopped just outside the circle, waiting. Ethan took a step back, and they didn't follow. Slowly, he and Kara retreated into the forest, the hum fading with each step. By the time they reached the edge, the mist had lifted and sunlight filtered through the trees. The world felt normal again, too normal, as if nothing had happened. Back in town, they didn't tell anyone. The police wouldn't believe them, and even if they did, what could they do? The forest wasn't something you could fence off or burn down. It would wait, as it always had, for the next person to wander too far in. Weeks later, Ethan left town. He thought putting distance between himself and the forest would help. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, he still hears the faint hum. And sometimes, when he passes a park or a wooded trail, he catches sight of a pale figure standing just beyond the trees. Watching Kara stayed behind, but they kept in touch. In her last message, she said the forest had been quiet lately, no strange dreams, no messages, no new disappearances. She sounded hopeful, but Ethan knew better. The silence wasn't the end. It was only the pause before the next story began. He didn't tell her that 2 days ago he'd received another message from an unknown number. It was a photo. This one showed Kara standing in the circle, her eyes pale and empty, looking straight at the camera.